dramatically increased the amount of money supply out there, and that's just not just bank reserves. That's actual people's deposits, because it wasn't just QE; it was QE plus fiscal stimulus that actually got out to people. So we basically increased people's ability to spend and purchase things, while not increasing the supply of those goods and services in the most case. In some cases, we actually reduced them. And so it's natural that we ran into this issue, especially when you combine it with complex global supply chains that spent the past 25 years being more and more efficient and less resilient. So I think I like to flip the question on its head, because people are like, why are prices going so much right now? And it's like, well, they were only low as they were over the past, especially, 10, 20 years, because we basically had all that disinflationary force of like constant globalization. And we've kind of, if you look at, say, global trade as a percentage of global GDP, that peaked back in 2008, 2009, and it's been going sideways ever since. So we had this long period of globalization, and then we're kind of consolidating with the amount of globalization that we have. And we couldn't even be possibly taking a step back from that high level mark. And so some of those disinflationary pressures of globalization are not really present. And so this is kind of like what we're finding when prices actually are, when you need to hire domestically, or when you're not in the constant state of outsourcing. So that's overall how I'm approaching it, and really kind of paying attention to fiscal stimulus, paying attention to wage and labor shortages and things like that. Another thing that's interesting is that, obviously the CPI includes hedonic adjustments. And so if, let's say, cars, for example, if you bought a Toyota Camry 25 years ago, it was like, half the amount of money, right? So roughly doubled in that time, if I remember roughly correctly. But if you look at car CPI, it's basically flat since then. Up a little bit, I think. And the reason is basically because they said, okay, the car is twice as expensive, but it's also so much better than the older one. So you have better navigation, better safety features, better gas mileage, and certainly it's better. The question, obviously, quantifying how much better is a tricky thing. However, one thing I'm seeing now is that services are getting worse, but of course we're not doing hedonic adjustments to increase the CPI, right? So we're paying more money for services that are generally, less pleasant or less efficient than they were 2 years ago. But of course, that doesn't show up in the CPI. So it is, obviously it's always a challenge to manage a basket of measuring overall price increases.
Mm-hmm. So what is an example of some of these supply shortages that have had outsized impacts? You mentioned, cars. Would the semiconductor shortage be a good example of these shortages causing many downstream effects that are masking the inflation?
Semiconductors are a huge one because the place where it's showing up, I think the most obvious is cars, because it's like, that phrase, like, for want of a nail, like the horseshoe fell off, and for want of a horseshoe, like the horse didn't make it, the message wasn't delivered, and for want of a delivered message, like the battle was lost. There's like that old saying, and it's kind of like that with supply chains, right? So for want of like this, like, say a $5 semiconductor, Toyota can't finish their car. And so then there's a massive bottleneck in basically there's not enough new cars out there. And so that elevates the price of used cars, right? Because, people are sitting on cars and people need cars really bad. That pushes up the price until those people, just sell the car they don't need anymore. And so and then that even trickles through. So that impacts the price of platinum group metals. Because ironically, if you have less car demand, like demand for those metals from the car manufacturers where they're heavily used, because you're temporarily reducing production because you have a semiconductor shortage, it basically trickles through all sorts of weird things like that. And so I would say that's one of the biggest ones. We've obviously run into other ones earlier. We ran into that period of a lumber shortage, ran into other things. The semiconductor one's challenging because those are multi-billion-dollar advanced foundries, right? So those aren't ones you can just kind of snap your fingers and address overnight. Obviously, they can fix them eventually, but those are very costly. And there's a reason why there's only a handful of countries in the world that produce most of the advanced semiconductors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like a very centralized but capital-intensive production schedule, right?
Absolutely. And basically there's a number of countries that produce kind of medium and lower end semiconductors, but really the high end ones, there's only a few. And then it's also more concentrated in the sense that some of the machines required that those foundries purchase there's really only a handful of makers of those machines as well. So from top to bottom, it's a pretty centralized space. And when you think of a semiconductor company, like people might think of NVIDIA, for example, a lot of those are fabless semiconductor companies. They don't actually make the semiconductor. They have one of those makers make it for them, after they've designed it and they've done all the kind of the pre-work. And so Taiwan Semiconductors is the biggest overall producer. And obviously, so that's got strategic importance with Taiwan. But basically, when every company in the world, or like a bunch of companies, are all going through this one giant semiconductor maker, that opens up all sorts of bottleneck issues. We don't really make semiconductors as distributed as you'd guess based on how many semiconductor companies there are. So I think it depends. I'm not a niche expert on this, on the like the underlying economics of running one of those plants. But I will say, basically, if you look at aluminum, for example, aluminum is an extremely electricity intensive thing when you refine it. And so that's why it actually ends up in some countries that have a lot of abundant electricity, because it's essentially their way of exporting their extra electricity. They say, hey, everybody bring us your like aluminum ore, and we'll go ahead and use our abundant electricity to make it into aluminum for you. Now, we've seen reports, for example, in Europe, that some of those aluminum refiners have had to shut down temporarily because of those high electricity prices that they were experiencing. Now, semiconductors, I would imagine, I can't imagine shutting down a semiconductor because electricity costs are high, because you have a lot of pricing power there. And basically, there will be suppliers saying we absolutely need those parts. But I mean, depending on how the contracts are structured, there's certainly people that know how those facilities work more than I do. But that would clearly be a priority to get those back online, perhaps more so than say aluminum, where it's a really kind of a more straightforward math problem there. Kind of a point that I've been making, I think, is that I'm both more bullish than most people on energy in the longer term, and maybe not as bullish as some people are in the near term. And what I mean by that is basically we saw a really big, energy shortages hit the headlines everywhere. The second half of this year, they're still over the headlines. We certainly have risk of more energy shortages. But when it becomes that consensus in that kind of near term, I think that there is some vulnerability to surprise to the downside. What if we have a mild winter, for example? There's things like that. But longer term, regardless of that happens, I don't have high conviction about energy over the next 6 months, because it's partially weather, it's partially human decisions, things like that. But I do think that structurally, looking out over the 2020s decade, we're going to be in a more energy scarce environment than the 2010s, basically because this, especially the second half of the 2010s, was characterized by overabundance, right? So we made a lot of unprofitable shale oil, which then got dumped on the market and basically pushed down global prices. Whereas we worked off a lot of that sort of excess supply, and we combine it with ESG mandates and things like that. I think we're kind of setting up ourselves structurally for more energy shortage. Now, I think eventually they respond to that, but that's not something you snap your fingers and do right away. So that can contribute. I mean, obviously those, hydrocarbons are used in a variety of things directly, and then they're also used to directly or indirectly power manufacturing places and things like that. So I do think that will have periods of leaking into the rest of the supply chain, as we're seeing now. If you look at the long-term kind of CPI, for example, or other ways to measure inflation, it's unmistakably correlated with energy prices, right? So because it's the master commodity underpinning most other things. Basically, it's really hard to get inflation without two things: wage growth and high oil prices, or high gasoline prices, and all that downstream stuff.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information, and it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
Do you want to know one thing about crypto? I made over 3,000% in profit in a few weeks. Fact is, the traditional financial system, the traditional money system makes you poor, not rich. If you want to earn $500,000, $1 million, you have to wait until you're 50, 60, 70. In the traditional financial system, and you probably will still be broke. And you will be old. This is not a sexy combination, as you can imagine. But the question is, how can you start in crypto and make these profits? Where to invest? Where to start? My name is Gunnar and I'm from Germany, as you can hear, and things are a little bit different in Germany. More about that later on. Fact is, there are lots of different cryptocurrencies. It's a gigantic universe where beginners and professionals get easily lost. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are 7 key steps you need to follow to become successful in this market. You have to know them, and if you fail one of them, it's literally impossible to succeed in this market. Just an example, one of the key points is your exchange, and one of the biggest are, for example, Binance and Coinbase. These are trusted and well-established exchanges, but, and this is a big but, you won't find the super profitable coins on those exchanges. The unknown super profitable coins that get gigantic profits are not traded on those kind of exchanges. They are traded on much smaller insider platforms that are barely known. And I can tell you what those super secret exchanges are and why they are so profitable. And another super important thing are the right information sources. The point is, the internet is gigantic. There are hundreds and hundreds of YouTube channels, blogs, pages, and much more. And there are also market makers and influencers. For example, Elon Musk, he is not a crypto guy, but the moment he recommended Dogecoin, it went through the roof, to the moon, so to say. But why did he recommend it? Where did he hear it from? He didn't hear it from newspapers. And believe me, he is listening to someone. But you have to know who, and you have to react before he is reacting. This is really, really important. And these are only 2 of the 7 steps you have to follow in order to be successful in crypto. And if you want to know all of these steps in much more detail, and if you want to have a comprehensive checklist, here's what you should do. There is a link below this video. Click on this link and you will get the opportunity to subscribe to my channel. Click on the link and you will see a video where I explain the next steps. So see you soon. Click on the link now. I'll see you there.